Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we're going to be going over a bunch of potential decklist options for the upcoming Historic Metagame Challenge that's running on Arena from the 17th through the 20th. So this is kind of an extension of the weekly meta series that we do on the channel, where every week on the channel we look at the top performing decks on the Arena ladder across each format, best of one, best of three. As long as the data is available, we try to catch it once a week and then kind of monitor the trends of the actual meta, seeing what's working best, especially for those who want to kind of make that push into Mythic as well as get a high placement in terms of the Mythic rank. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the challenge, the metagame challenges, they're usually a set fee. It's best of three format. And if your goal is to get to 7 wins before you get a single loss, if you get a loss, you're knocked out. And each win progressively gets you more packs, with I believe 7 wins giving you 30 packs of the set. So what we're going to do here is go over some deck choices. I want to preface on this. Historic best of 3 is probably the broadest in terms of what you can play. Historic in general is a format where people have a lot of pet decks. And you're rewarded more for knowing a deck at times than, like, you're better at times knowing a deck very well that's a tier 2 deck than just picking up a tier 1 deck. And having no reps with it. So you'll see kind of a variety. While we are going to try to cover as much as we can, even what we normally do is we get the data from Untapped.gg, which is the companion tool that tracks all the arena stats if people are using the tracker. For standard, I can look at like 100,000 games. I can give you best of 3 win rates, stuff like that. For historic, I basically have one deck that comes up for the last little bit since the recent sets dropped. So we're looking at a combination of Untapped for this. We're looking at MTG Arena Zone. We're looking at just stuff that I found on Twitter. We're looking at content creators that I know have played a lot of Historic and do well in it. I've looked at MTG Melee. There hasn't been really a Historic tournament since January. So it's a little tough finding best of 3 data. So I will preface, there's some objectively like top tier decks, and then there's a bunch of stuff you can play around the edges. Like people do well at times with like 5-color Niv or random like creature piles or like random combo decks like Belcher. Some people do well in best of 3. It's more of a best of 1 deck. But so kind of prefacing with that. So normally I like to come with like actual objective stats. This time it's going to be some stats and then some individual kind of individual performance of folks that have done well with particular decks. The kind of core, for those of you who haven't played Historic much, artifact decks are very powerful. Artifact aggro decks. There's the red-black or Jund kind of mid-range piles propped up with Crucius. Crucius is one of the most powerful cards in the format, just allowing you to do a whole bunch of busted stuff. Blue-white control is a kind of form of deck that can play well. You have aggressive decks. Various kind of burn-esque aggro decks. There's goblins that's very powerful. There's wizards that's very powerful, kind of mixed into that. And then you have the gambit, right? Like you could see merfolk, you could see humans, you can see Esper, Greasefang, you can see Heliod combo. But we're going to kind of focus on some decks here and kind of go from there. So we're going to jump into it. The deck that has the highest win rate from Untapped.gg is the Rakdos Midrange deck, 66% win rate. The only thing that this deck I would suggest off the bat, it's not playing Blackleaf Cliffs, the new fast land. I would trim the Sulphurous Springs and one of each basic and then play for the Blackleaves. But this deck here is using a lot of powerful cards that are Historic only. You have Crucius, Titan of the Waves, 3 mana, 3/3. And at your end step, you get to discard a card and basically choose higher or less mana. And then you randomly seek a card with that from your library into your hand. So it kind of like pulls it. So, for example, if you discard Seasoned Pyromancer and you say higher, you always get Shieldred. It also creates a treasure token on each turn. Now, the thing is, this card is supposed to inform your opponent if you chose higher or lower. There's a bug right now that doesn't seem like it's going to be fixed in time, so it doesn't provide that information to your opponent. So it got even more busted. But this card lets you kind of pseudo-tutor, helps you discard lands, helps you ramp, provides a whole bunch of value. It's a must-kill on threat before end step. Seasoned Pyromancer is also a card that helps out these decks. You're often trading 1 for 1, Or in the late game, you have stuff like discard spells that aren't effective. You get to throw those away, make tokens, and refill your hand. It also gains you a bunch of life with Shieldred out, which is a nice little combo. And then Fable the Mirror Breaker, obviously a very powerful card that we see from Standard. In the 1-drop slot, we have Fatal Push as hits pretty much most of the creatures in the format. You have Revolt easily turned on by Crucius or Blood tokens, stuff of that nature. 8 discard spells, Inquisition of Kozilek, as well as Thoughtseize. Again, when these aren't good, you discard them with either Fable or Seasoned Pyromancer, so it limits your downside of drawing bad cards, even with Crucius discard. And then you have access to Molten Impact. This is a flexible, often 2-for-1 removal spell. Deals with the first creature, then lets you kind of cast a discard spell that incidentally also deals 1, 2, or 3 damage to the creature or planeswalker as well. Copy of Kroxa, some Bloodtide Harvesters, Shieldred, and then your mana base, you got a castle, and then some creature lands in there in the mix. In your sideboard, you have Cut Down as early removal, Duress is more hand hate when needed, Rahilda against like slower decks, or decks that just don't have a lot of removal if you're going into the grindy matchups. It kind of provides some card advantages, especially against like blue-white control. They need to play on their turn, otherwise you start stealing their stuff. Graveyard Hate, Sweepers, and Artifacts. Brotherhood's End's very good in this format since it hits all these low-to-the-ground artifact decks, which we'll cover in a sec. Liliana for like the grindier matchups, blue-white control, stuff of that nature. The Mirror. Knight of Soul Betrayal is good against Goblins. So the thing is, like, in specific matchups, you cut the Shieldreds, you bring in one of your 4-drops, and then they're kind of your golden ticket to kind of kill your opponent. So against Goblins, you Knight of Soul Betrayal them, and you kind of go wide effect, like Weenie style, Knight of Soul Betrayal. Against the artifact decks, you just bring in Shatterstorm, which ends their entire board state. And then Chandra's for the counterspell heavy matchups. So there's that for Rakdos Midrange. I'll paste all these deck lists into the video description so you can just copy and paste those over. We then go to the artifact aggro deck. So this list is from Alth MTG, another content creator, very, very good player, plays a lot of Historic as well. He's got a #1 mythic the last 2 months and hit #1. So January, February, finished the whole month #1 mythic, and then this month hit #1 with this particular list. So credit to where credit's due. And then this deck is built around Retrofitter Foundry, which is kind of a staple of these artifact decks. And basically you're playing this for predominantly its last mode, where you sacrifice a Thopter, you create a 4/4 colorless construct, Ornithopter on turn 1. With this, lets you have a 4/4, lets you tap, untap in the grindy games, just create value. You have Esper Sentinel as a tax effect that draws you cards. You have Hope of Girapur, which is another Thopter for the Foundry, or can kind of prevent your opponent from playing a sweeper or comboing, stuff of that nature. You have Portable Hole as removal, hits a lot of the low-to-the-ground items. This is a Lurrus deck. Lurrus is still legal in this format, so you'll often see it accompanying a lot of these creature decks. Vault Scourge is just a lifelinker that can be pumped up. Ingenious Smith helps you find your other artifacts, and then gets bigger when you cast said artifacts. Innovative Metatech is the new card of the deck, and then whenever one or more artifact creatures you control deal combat damage to the player, you seek a non-land, so you get to basically always draw gas, but not technically draw, so you don't get hit by like Shieldred or Narset, stuff like that, to your hand. And then there's 8 ways to pump up your creatures. And Soul Artifact gives them base power 5/5 to your artifacts. It can also enchant the Darksteel Citadel that's in the mana base to make it an indestructible 5/5. Plays really nice with Vault Scourge since you can gain the life. And then you have Mashiko, which provides pump based on number of artifacts or enchantments you control. Mana base, very simple. You got a bunch of duels, and then 1 Iganjo. Like I mentioned, it's a Lurrus deck, so you have access to the companion to rebuy stuff from your graveyard. A couple pieces of Graveyard Hate, some more removal and Glass Casket. Any type of ETB style deck, you have Hushbringer to shut that off. And then Metallic Rebuke is a counter spell that it's basically 1 mana counter for 3, unless they pay 3. You could also look at something like Dovin's Veto if you want, as just a catch-all removal, but the biggest thing is like Supreme Verdict gets played here, which is uncounterable. So this is usually kind of pick and choose. You can do that. You can do memory or mystical with the 1 mana, the blue one that counters blue spells. Now you have Historic Burn. So this is a list from Binary Soloist. I've played this deck to some extent as well in Best of 3. I've played it a lot in Best of 1. It's really fun. So they got #1 Mythic last month at one point. They were one of the first to get Mythics. And this is a burn-based deck. It's another Lurrus companion deck, so you have your Lurrus hanging out here. And you're playing a lot of aggressive creatures. Monastery Swiftspear gets bigger with prowess. Dragon Rage Chandler lets you surveil and then gets flying. And just a 3/1 flyer is really good for 1 mana. You have Kumano, and then Eidolon of the Great Revel to ping your opponent for any of their cheap spells. Things like Eidolon counting as enchantments and creatures goes a long way, so it's easy to kind of get Delirium for the Dragon Rage Chandler. The reason you're playing white is for access to Lightning Helix. Gains you life, helps you kind of skew off some of those race scenarios. You have card advantage with light up the stage, as well as Risk Factors, a card that when I was chatting with them, very good in the Rakdos matchup, kind of forces some damage. If it gets discarded, you get some value out of your graveyard as well. And then just a ton of burn spells, Lightning Helix, Static Discharge, Play with Fire, Screw the Critics, just kind of all mixed into there. Mana base, you got 3 Den of the Bugbears, and then there's a bunch of duels and a couple of Ramanapa runes. The sideboard, I kind of deviated, so I was playing Brotherhood's End in mine. I really like that against the artifact decks, just kind of shifting into like a mono red kind of control-ish deck. But you see cards like Fragment Reality as removal, just catch all, 1 mana, get rid of something. Unchained Berserker for any of the white-based decks gets you pseudo unblockable, also pretty good against blue-white control. Basically, they only have sweepers to deal with it since it doesn't hit by Wandering Emperor, stuff of that nature. Searing Blood is just a removal spell that also deals some damage. Devote Decree versus the red-black decks. Then you got your Molten Impacts for scalable damage, Roiling Vortex for tax, and anti-life gain effects. We then go to Zoomerjund. So this one is from Kirizao. Apologies on that pronunciation, but they got #40 Mythic in January with this. So this is kind of like the modern Jund of Arena, and it's playing a bunch of busted cards. So similar to the Rakdos deck, you have access to Fatal Push, Thoughtseize, Inquisition, Crucius, Fable the Mirrorbreaker, and then Sheoldreds. What you're getting out of the green is Tarmogoyf, a very iconic card. This card was like $200 at one point. Now they're like $15. But it gets bigger based on things in graveyards, number of different types. So just a big beater for 2 mana. Assassin's Trophy is catch-all removal, Molten Impact, as we mentioned. You have Assemble the Team. So this lets you search the top third of your library, round it up for a card, and then put it in your hand. So you have a lot of kind of situational cards, or in a pinch you need a certain removal spell or discard or something like that. It's just kind of a pseudo-tutor in the deck there itself. The other card that we're getting here, digital only, is Jarzel Dark Age Scion. So another 3 mana, 3/3. This has starting intensity 1. So how it works is at the beginning of your turn, your combat, you get to cast a card in your graveyard with basically equal to its intensity. So it comes down, you can cast a card for 1 mana. So you can cast a discard spell from your graveyard for free, or a Fatal Push, for example. Then it goes to starting intensity 2. So then you can cast a 2-drop for 3, or a 3-drop for, and then you kind of keep going up. Each time you cast something, it increases its intensity. So you basically get to recycle your removal spells, the things you throw into the graveyard with stuff like Fable the Mirrorbreaker, or just like recast something like Sheoldred. And then you have on the top end Minsk and Boo, just a powerful planeswalker, the 4 mana. So this one's 5 mana, unlike the real card. So they kind of nerfed it that way compared to the real card, but it's still seeing play. It's still formidable threat, just recurring, pressure, card draw built into this card here. Sideboard, or mana base, bunch of duels, kind of some Fable passages. Your sideboard, you have Rending Volleys for blue-white cards, Duress is more hand hate, Noxious Grass first white-green cards, Unlicensed Hearse for graveyard hate, Liliana for kind of grind value, Omnixus for the grindier matchups, as well as Chandra. Hideizuku consumes all for any of the low to the ground, the artifact decks, like the Lurrus deck, stuff like that, and then Brotherhood's End, as we mentioned. Next up, we have Mono Green Devotion. This was from AGTK, #17 Mythic in January. So similar to Explorer, we have Nixthos Shrine to Nyx in this deck that allows you to build a Devotion shell. But banned in Pioneer is Leyline of Abundance. So this you can cast for 0 mana, or basically put into play at the beginning of turn 0, and then if a creature were to tap for mana, it taps for an additional mana. It's also a mana sink for 8 mana that you can put a counter on each creature you control. So you have a similar effect. Your 8 dorks, but this version is playing Paradise Druid over some numbers of Wolf Willow. You also have Freyleys, which lets you tap and tap creatures, as well as Seeking Elves. And then its ultimate is you conjure Regal Force, which is a 7 mana 7/7 that draws a card for each green card I think you have. Kiora, as well as Old Growth, some of it looks kind of staples. Tap and tap Nykthos, adds a bunch of devotion. Karn for a Karn package, which we'll cover in a sec. Nissa, the Nissa lands also tap for additional mana. So you get the buff from Nissa's tap plus the Leyline buff. And then Cavalier and Storm the Festival to help you kind of dig through your deck to find your Nykthos or key cards. This is a Karn package, so your entire sideboard. This is the easiest deck to sideboard because you don't sideboard. Just a bunch of silver bullets and artifacts for the deck. So you have Graveyard Hate. Sorry, in a pinch you hit a land. It's indestructible, good with Nissa. Artifact Enchantment Hate. Graveyard or kind of Collected Company kind of hate. Name a specific threat, turn off an ability, Bankbuster for card advantage, Graveyard Hate and Licensor. So this is kind of one shot. This is recurring. Stonebraid for combo hate, Pestilence Cauldron. You're playing it for the Restorative Burst side, which lets you do an infinite combo of just gaining a whole bunch of life and eventually milling out your opponent. With the flip side, 2 Karns, 2 Kioras, and 15 mana lets you do that. Karn Silex is a board wipe. Portal to Phyrexia as like a bigger mana board wipe that gets you to replay your opponent's stuff in the graveyard. Cityscape Leveler is blow up a specific thing. Chroma's Memorial is very good against the black-red decks. Sky Sovereign for artifact. Not for artifact. Just deals 3 kind of recurring damage. Mightstone, Meekstone can either deal 5/5 or draw you 2 cards. So just a bunch of flexible things there. Alrighty, next up. We got Rakdos Midrange, Rakdos Goblins. So this is from Gurmag, #1 Mythic in November. This deck's largely is not changed, but we'll kind of cover the deck. So this is a Muxus deck, which lets you look at the top 6 cards, put all goblins into play that are 5 CMC or less. This version here is playing both Pashilic Mons, which lets you, whenever it or another goblin dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. And then you have Siege Gang Command Lieutenant that lets you, it creates 2 goblins when it enters the battlefield, and you can sacrifice a goblin and you drain your opponent for a life and you gain a life. So these, every time you have a goblin die, it makes your opponent take 2 damage. So you have Skirk to get you ahead on mana, sacrifice goblins, provide you card advantage, Munitions Expert's removal based on number of goblins. Snoop lets you play off the top of your library goblins and also has can basically mirror their activated abilities, so like Krenko, the sacrifice effect, the Siege Gang, anything of that nature. Reuvenwald is a lord that also lets you play cards, goblins when it dies. Haste and a boost, and then Krenko to make copies. Fable the Mirror Breaker also to make copies, makes a goblin. It itself is a goblin, and some Dens of the Bugbear in there as well. Sideboard got Chandra for the Grindier matchups, go wide decks. And then Chain Whirlers kind of blow up everything that's like Weenie style. Ringleader for card advantage in the Grindier matchups. Some Fatal Push as removal. Thoughtseize for kind of hitting like, say, a sweeper, combo pieces, stuff like that. Shatterstorm for the artifact decks. And Licensors for the graveyard decks. So then we go to Mistmin. So Mistmin is like the historic savant. Plays a bunch of historic decks, frequently is in like the top 50 mythic, finished #1 a bunch of times, has had some absurd win rates, like 95% win rates over like 100 plus games, plays a lot of control. So this deck is from October, it's blue-white control. If we look at, he went something like 80, 82, and 16 with it. So like crazy win rate. The deck's largely not changed. The thing is with blue-white, you can really configure it to your discretion in terms of like what you're playing against, stuff of that nature. The biggest kind of thing to include in this deck is Divine Purge. Given the prevalence of these artifact aggro decks, you might want to go up to a second Divine Purge. Just provides you, it exiles all artifacts and 3 creatures 3 CMC or less. But this deck here is largely winning just off like Shark Typhoon, Fairy, Emperor. Lots of sweepers, lots of counters, lots of control elements, and then you also have some Hall of the Storm Giants or Castle Ardenvale. Post-board against like the Rakdos matchups, you have Wedding Announcements, Baneslayer for the aggressive slanted decks, and then situational counters or removal spells as needed. So this one is this kind of like go-to. It's a very strong deck if you enjoy blue-white control. Archmage Charm is the big card that's not seen in Pioneer. Just a really flexible 3-mana counter, draw, or gain control. Also from Mistman, so this is a Tainted Pact deck. So this is a combo deck. He had quite a bit of success with this one too that I was watching on his stream. So basically, everything is a single one of in the deck, including lands, other than Jace Wielder of Mystery and Tainted Pact. So with Tainted Pact, you basically flip cards till you reveal the same. So oftentimes what you're trying to do is basically Tainted Pact for Jace, and then have another Tainted Pact in hand. The Jace draws when you have no cards in your library, or you Tainted Pact for a Tainted Pact, and then the second Tainted Pact finds Jace, and then you basically win that way there. There's also kind of two other attacking combos with Tainted Pact. So Crackling Drake as well as Lelia. So with Lelia, whenever a card goes into exile, it gets +1/1, and then Crackling Drake's power and toughness are equal. There's power, is equal to the number of instants and sorceries in your exile or graveyard. So you could kind of exile your whole library and then deal damage like that. That's conditioned on them not having a blocker. The rest of the deck is just control elements, discard. It's just like a bunch of different removal spells or a bunch of different kind of counter spells or like card advantage spells, stuff of that nature. And then you have your sideboard here as well, just another situational. In matchups you want more removal, in matchups you need more kind of control elements. It's all featured there. And then you have the deck list pasted here. And then going to melee, so Izzet Wizards is a popular deck in the format. The only thing I would say, so it's more popular in best of one. With this particular deck, the only thing I would say offhand is Frenzied Geist Blaster is not really a card that's played in these. So you should be playing an additional copy of Balmor. It should be 3 Balmors, and then they typically place a larger number of Considers instead. But basically, buffed Symmetry Sage lets you turn any creature when you cast an instant base power to 3. So you're basically trying to buff up Dreadhorde Arcanist to flash back bigger spells from your graveyard, Reckless Iteration, or Expressive Iteration, Mentor's Guidance, Static Discharges you can recast. You also have Reckless Charge in this deck that gives a big power boost as well as haste, so it lets you kind of push through large chunks of damage. Balmor gives your creatures trample, so it pushes through a whole bunch of damage. Jingantha Companion, notably, you have to take out Jingantha if you're bringing in Brotherhood's End, but just a bunch of removal, counters, graveyard hate as required. I don't know how good this deck is, I just want to share it because it looks freaking sweet. This is a Naya Domain aggro deck. So it is, can we do visual view? They went 5-1, I think, in a tournament. So you have things like the Spider that just comes into play and can keep coming back, 4/3 for 3, Territorial Kavu, which gets basically for each domain, it gets bigger. So this is a 2-mana 5/5. Nishibo Brawler, 2-mana 5/3. Bone Crusher Giant, Questing Beast, Spellbreaker, Rodda's Firebrand that can make things not block, and you really take advantage of the Domain. You have Kenrith that can activate any of its abilities in this deck. Leyline Binding as a way to exile anything for 1 mana. Nylea's Presence, an interesting one. It's 2-mana card that cycles, but basically turns on all the domain. Gaia's Might is a big pump spell. Collision Colossus is a pump spell and deals with flyers. And then Minsk and Boo that we mentioned in the other deck. Bunch of kind of like duels and stuff like that. Lightning Heal, so like this removal, combo hate, kind of the run-of-the-mill type stuff in the sideboard. That's it for the deck, or the decks of this kind of mention. Like I said, Historic's wide open. Auras sometimes sees play, like people have their pet decks. Like I said, humans could be a deck, Grease Fang, stuff like that. If you're looking for a particular deck list that I didn't mention, drop a note in the comments. I'll try to find you whatever I can do the best, but these are kind of ones that stood out to me. In any case, thanks for watching. Hope you have a great one and stay safe out there.